So I want to tell you the story of an American couple that moved to Russia.
All right, hello everybody. We are the Huffman family. We are the first official family living in the American village in the Moscow region.
Russian food, Russian food, Russian food, Russian food.
The Russian army is no joke. These guys are tough. You know, I signed up for this, and it's my honor to defend our new country, and we can get this victory.
They posted a video in the last couple of days begging for help because this woman's husband has been sent to the front lines through the Russian meat grinder without any training.
He was told he would not be training for 2 weeks and going straight to the front lines. They are going to put him on the front lines. So we are all praying really hard that he could actually be utilized for his skills and not just be put as a fighter.
And this happened literally 24 hours after another American woman who fled to Russia in 2019 was attacked for her race. She literally produced a film with Russia Today when she got to Moscow.
Why did I make up my mind to move to Russia? I wanted to leave a country where I was facing discrimination.
Saying she moved there for her safety because people of color were treated better in Russia. And what unites both of these people is that they were both lied to by Russian propaganda. But that doesn't necessarily mean they got their propaganda because they were reading Kremlin newspapers or watching Russia Today. They probably read it in the New York Times. And literally, if you buy a copy of the New York Times today, you'll find a giant feature, a feature about Kursk, a feature written by a journalist in Moscow. A feature written by a journalist in Moscow who is embedded with Russian troops. And you don't get embedded with Russian troops without having every single word approved by the Kremlin, which means every single word in this article is approved by Moscow. In the New York Times, one of America's most read newspapers. And let's actually look at what this article says. First of all, you open it up and of course it's one of their biggest features. It shows a soldier looking miserable, looking sad in a church that's damaged. But that's interesting because it shows the New York Times is really upset about churches being destroyed. But if you do a search for that, there's nothing about the churches damaged in Izium, and there's nothing about the churches and cathedrals destroyed in Odessa and here in Bucha, destroyed by Russia. There's nothing about the priests that were tortured in Kherson. So it looks like the only time the New York Times are pearl clutching about Christianity being under attack is when it's done by Russians in their own towns. And that is exactly what happened in Kursk. I was there in November, 2 days before the counteroffensive started, the one that North Koreans were involved in. And the very streets that are photographed in this article were completely intact when I was there. You can see this in the footage, that's why I filmed it. And those villages only got destroyed when the counteroffensive started, when North Korean troops and Russian troops started bombing the shit out of every single residential neighborhood to try and take it back. But if you read the New York Times article, it assumes that it was Ukrainians. But again, I was there months into the incursion and none of that damage was on camera. And that's not the only thing. The article is filled with quotes from Russian residents that were living in Sudzha and living in these towns, saying that they couldn't even look Ukrainian soldiers in the eye, that they were terrified the whole time, that there was genocide being carried out, and that residents were basically being shot in the street by Ukrainians. Which is weird, because when I was there were children cycling through the streets, there were people collecting aid, food, and bread. I asked people what their main concerns were, and they told me it was that they couldn't get cell phone signal because of the drones in the sky, which is the opposite of what the New York Times published. And what's also completely different about the account that she wrote and the account that I published is that I didn't need approval from this country to publish that story, because this country actually has press freedom. The only thing I was asked to do was censor some of the soldiers' positions, literally to protect them, which is completely normal for war journalism. And I know this sounds crazy and shocking from something like the New York Times, but it actually isn't. If you look at articles published in the 1930s, specifically 1933, they were heavily criticized for talking about Hitler's rise because something that was good. Deborah Lipstadt talked about this herself. And they did it during the Holodomor. They whitewashed the atrocities by the USSR, and now they're whitewashing the atrocities committed by Russians. And this is where the fundamental problem comes with information and with our media, because the news media is obsessed with the idea of balance, that in every conflict, there are always two sides that should be treated equally. And that isn't the case with every war, and it's not the case with what's happening in Ukraine. And it's important to remember a very basic fact. Russia invaded this country in 2014. Russia invaded this country in 2022. Russia is the aggressor, and writing about it like it's two siblings having an argument is bullshit. But this is the fundamental reason that I went to Kursk, because I knew exactly what Russia was going to do as soon as they took it back, and that was to put out lies and propaganda. And if you watch Russia today, the second Russians set foot back in Suja, they did exactly that. But when I woke up and decided to make this video this morning, I didn't want you to just take my word for it, so I called up my friend who also went to Kursk about 3 months before I did. His name is Tom Much, and I sat down with him this afternoon. Right, so I'm just with Tom in a local cafe just here in the center of Kyiv, and we're going to chat about his experience in Kursk. You spent a little bit more time talking to actual people there, right? I spoke to only 2 or 3 locals who said they were given water, they were fine. The only complaints they had was the cell phone network had gone down, so they couldn't contact relatives. What did they tell you that was different to the article?
So what I saw is, it was very interesting. We were going in with a group of Ukrainian soldiers, and one of them got a call on his radio being like, yeah, there's a Russian drone inbound, we need to get cover. And so we ended up going to a basement, and that basement was full of about 20, 30 like Russian civilians who were still living there. Now, obviously, they weren't having a very nice time. It was very cold, and it was dark and damp. However, the Ukrainians were bringing them food and water. Ukrainian medics, if people had, injuries or they had, some kind of infection or something, they were being treated, they were given all of the essentials that they need. I'm not saying they had a good time, but let's compare that to say how Russian occupiers treated Ukrainian civilians in Bucha or Kherson or Mariupol, where, that at the absolute best, they didn't care at all about their lives, and at the worst, they would just shoot them on the streets, or they would drop drones on them for fun, or, they committed appalling crimes, and there is absolutely no evidence that the Ukrainians did any of that, or anything that would meet the New York Times sort of description of this sort of like trail of death and destruction that they left in their wake. And I want to pick up on one of the things that the New York Times article said. This really pissed me off. It said Ukraine turned this little sliver of Russia into a battlefield full of death and destruction. And it's like, no. Okay, not only did Ukraine not start the war, the Russians invaded Ukraine, Ukraine didn't even start this particular battle. Let's go back to February 2022. The Russians actually invaded Sumy from Kursk, from Suja. Those were all used as staging points for the invasion of Sumy and a further invasion of Kiev. I have a big section about that actually in my book, which I've just published, The Dogs of Mariupol, where I talk about this battle that everybody's forgotten about. Then, for the next 2.5 years, they had artillery and drones in Kursk that they were using to bomb Ukrainian civilian areas in Sumy. It wasn't a very well-covered story, but they turned Kursk into a battlefield well before the Ukrainians ever came over the border.
And then the interviews that the author put out as well seem to be like the exact same Kremlin lines that they've been publishing about how this is just like a dispute between 2 brotherly neighbors. Because did you read some of the quotes?
Yeah, that was really, really interesting, because they interviewed these people, and then they said, they quoted these civilians as just saying, oh, the Ukrainians have totally fallen for Western propaganda, it's all NATO expansion's fault, it's all this, it's all that. But what they did is they quoted them, and they just let those lines go completely unchallenged, right? They never, if your interviewee says something that's fairly demonstrably untrue, you can still quote it, but you have to say, look, this is the context. And for instance, I think it was interesting to say that there was nothing in the article that was like, look, people in Russia cannot speak freely about these issues. People in Russia have to toe a particular line, or they are under the threat of arrest, torture, whatever, you know. I was talking actually, hearing about one case, one of the rare cases where a Russian teacher had stood up in a school and said, I actually think we're the aggressors in this case. They arrested her and they threatened to take her children away and put them in a mental institution. You cannot have, you can't just quote these people uncritically without giving the background details that they aren't able to speak.
If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. The reason I go to these places in Ukraine and go to places like Kursk is to gather the truth and to get it on camera, because moments like this are when it matters most. So the next time you open the New York Times, the next time you watch CNN, just take a few minutes to look at who wrote the article and what their background is. This woman who published this piece, she still lives in Moscow and she was embedded in Russian troops, and that should be a lot of red flags. But anyway, if you like this, please hit subscribe. It's really important for the algorithm, and I'm going to be posting as much as possible here in Ukraine. And next week, I'm going back east to bring you a frontline report. So if you enjoyed this, hit like, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.